Decals are powerful tools for restoring antique sewing machines, such as this 1875 Basalt and Lock, but they have one significant drawback. Because they're printed on plastic, they have a definite thickness, and this thickness can create a raised line where they're cut. This line can catch the light and is obvious at several angles when viewing the decal. This reduces the effectiveness of the decal in recreating the artwork. One way to hide these lines is to cut the decal along an existing edge on the machine, like this one on our 1873 Raymond household sewing machine. Equally effective if the decal has a solid border, like this one on the cover to our Bremer and Bruckmann Colibri sewing machine, is to trim the decal right along the edge of the border. The high contrast between the gold of the decal's border and the black background makes it impossible for the human eye to pick out this raised edge. Those techniques don't work when you're dealing with open filigree designs like this. There's no way to trim the decal that the edges won't be obvious. I needed something better for the restoration of this 1881 crown because there's no way to hide the edges of the decals when dealing with such complicated artwork. What I came up with was a technique for creating ultrafine stencils to use as masks for applying paint or gold leaf. This eliminates all of the edge issues and reproduces much more closely the industrial transfers originally used. The stencil making process begins the same way as if you're making a decal. The only differences are that instead of white lines on a black background, you want black lines on a white background. Also, size the print as large as possible to fit on a 12 by 12 inch sheet of paper. In addition to a computer, you'll need something like this scan and cut. Stencils, as complicated as those we'll be producing, can't be cut by hand. Scan the print into the machine using the scan to cut data. This will format the scan so that the machine will cut on both sides of the lines instead of just down their centers. After scanning, trim the scan as close to the design as possible. And save. Close out the scanning. Recapture your pattern. There it is. And we're ready to start modifying it. The scan design is recorded as a large number of individual pieces. Because we're going to be resizing this, we need to combine them all. Okay, press that, and now they're all combined. Now we have to resize it, and this is why we printed the design out so large. An idiosyncrasy of the scan and cut, and I don't know if this is true for all of these devices, is that the scanner is not as accurate as the cutter. What this means is if you had printed the design out its actual size, which is much smaller than this, a lot of these lines would not have been picked up by the scanner. And when you went to cut it, they would be missing. By printing this larger, it lets the scanner pick up all the detail, and then the cutter can cut it. What we have to do now, though, is resize this. In actual size, this is 4 inches wide. So we press this, and we reduce it to 4 inches. Close enough. And move it up to the very center. If you had positioned the design diagonally to make it even longer, you could use this option for rotating it up. Okay, okay. Reload the mat with a piece of adhesive craft vinyl and cut. After the stencil is cut, use an X-Acto knife to touch up any vinyl that wasn't cut cleanly and some fine tweezers to remove the cut vinyl to create the stencil. Now we come to the tricky part. What we're going to do is cover the stencil with transfer tape. This holds the pieces in place while we apply it to our surface. I'm going to be using this piece of galvanized sheet metal for the demonstration. The problem is that even if you use removable vinyl for the stencil, it sticks so aggressively to the painted surface that one of two things is going to happen. After you gild it, when you pull the stencil material up, it can either pull the paint off the surface, even if you used etching primer, or even worse, some of the adhesive on the back of the stencil material, again, even if you use removable stuff, will stick to the paint. Either one of these will compromise how good the stencil turns out. To avoid that, what we're going to do is peel the backing off of the stencil once it's applied to the transfer tape, and then treat this with a little bit of powdered sugar, just enough to reduce the stickiness of the vinyl so that it's still tacky but not too sticky, so it releases cleanly. The problem is because we're reducing the stickiness on the vinyl, we also have to reduce the stickiness of the transfer tape, because if we don't, this is going to be stickier than this. When we pull the transfer tape up to do our gilding, this will pull up too. So what we do is just take the transfer tape, stick it down, and pull it up several times like this. This will reduce the stickiness. The number of times you need to do this depends on how clean the surface is and what type of surface it is. I find between 10 and 20 stick downs and pull-ups is usually enough. Once that's done, apply the transfer tape to the stencil, lift it up, and remove the backing. To reduce the stickiness, what I found works good is to take a little powdered sugar on the end of a small brush and lightly tap it to a makeup brush, and then very gently tap this down so there's just a slight trace of powder left on the brush. Then very lightly tap the stencil, then feel it. It should just be slightly, barely tacky. It's important at this point to check that none of the smaller stencil pieces have been pulled up. If they have, you can usually find them on the end of the brush, reapply them, and you're good to go. Even after reducing the stickiness of the stencil, once it's applied, you can't really move it without destroying it. So you want to be sure that you get it in the right place the first time. There's a couple things I like to do. First, I put a piece of tape to create a border where the bottom is going to go, and then a couple of index marks to tell me how to line up the decal. Another thing you can do is to use the backing that you peel off this, put it face down where it's going to go, apply your stencil, and once it's in the right position, work this out, and that'll give you a little bit more room to maneuver in the case that you don't get it right the first time. But let's live dangerously and see how this goes. And here we go. That looks pretty good. Down, and just press it lightly. Now, peel off the transfer tape very carefully and very slowly so that you don't peel off any of the stencil. And there you go. During all this handling, it's not unusual for some of the smaller free-floating pieces to have shifted around. If that happens, use the tip of an X-Acto knife to reposition them. Next, it's time to gild this, or if you prefer, use gold paint. After masking, apply your gold size or adhesive in the way you prefer. I like the pat and then blot dry technique because it produces the smoothest finish. But if you prefer, you can just brush it on. Just remember, you want a very thin coat. I prefer using pure 24 karat gold leaf because nothing else comes as close to matching the color and luster of the bronze powder paints that were used 150 years ago. Once it's applied, ponce it down with a soft brush, then brush away the excess, and repeat a couple of times. You don't want any loose flakes floating around. After that, remove the masking and you're almost done. The final step is to clear coat it to protect the gold from abrasion. Here's an example of how well this technique can work. It's not perfect because a few small errors had to be touched up with paint, but they're so small they're impossible to spot. On the plus side, there isn't a single decal edge to be seen anywhere on the machine. However, I have to warn anyone thinking of trying it that this is an extremely difficult, frustrating, and time-consuming process, averaging 1 hour per square inch of artwork. Altogether, it took 100 hours to reproduce and apply the filigree on this machine, easily twice as long as if decals had been used. My recommendation is to use decals wherever possible and resort to stenciling when nothing else will do. My next sewing machine restoration video is going to be about how to recreate silver-backed colored decals. I hope you'll find it interesting, and thanks again for watching.